They say every murderer makes one fatal mistake. Tonight, in The Portrait That Watched, we shall discover what that mistake was. I am Arthur Hastings, and this is The Little Grey Cells, where we chronicle the extraordinary cases of my dear friend, Hercule Poirot. First-time listeners, do make yourself known. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which part of the world is joining us tonight. The portrait is watching. The question, as always, is what it has seen. So, pour your tisane, find a comfortable chair, and do check, if you would, who is standing behind you. The game, as they say, is afoot. Chapter 1. The Beautiful Surface. "She is watching someone," said the young man. "Not us. Someone behind us." Nobody turned around. Nobody wished to be the first. The portrait hung at the far end of the gallery, framed in dark gilt against a wall of whitewashed stone. The woman in it was seated in shadow, her hands folded in her lap, her gown the colour of old cream. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense. Her face was too still for that. But her eyes, painted with a peculiar, uncanny precision, were directed not at the viewer, as portraits customarily demanded, but at some fixed point slightly beyond the left shoulder of whoever stood before her. As though she were attending to a presence in the room that no one else could see. The young man who had spoken was Nikos Vardakis, and he laughed immediately after he said it, which rather spoiled the effect. He was perhaps 26, handsomely built, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's fine eyes. He had been drinking since noon. "It is merely the angle of the light," said Matteo Bellini smoothly. "A trick of the brushwork. The painter, Vassiliou, you understand, not a great name but a genuine talent, employed a technique one sees occasionally in the late Flemish tradition. It is disconcerting, certainly. That is rather the point." Bellini spoke with the particular authority of a man who had spent 30 years persuading other people that he knew more than they did about beautiful things. He was slim, silver at the temples, and dressed with an Italianate elegance that managed to suggest both wealth and aesthetic principle. He had authenticated the portrait. He had brokered the sale. He smiled at the painting with the fond, slightly proprietary air of a man returning to visit a daughter he had successfully married off. Hercule Poirot stood a little apart from the others and said nothing at all. He had arrived at Villa Calypso that morning, conveyed by a small white boat from the harbour at Hydra, and his first impression of the island had been one of severe displeasure. There were no motor cars. The luggage was carried by donkeys. The path from the dock to the villa was paved with uneven stones arranged with no discernible logic. He had made the ascent with great dignity and considerable suffering, pausing twice to remove what he suspected was donkey-related material from his left shoe. The villa itself had restored his equanimity somewhat. It was a long, low building of white marble and pale stone, perched on a cliff above water of a blue so intense it seemed artificial. A terrace ran the full length of the south face, shaded by canvas awnings and furnished with cream-coloured chairs and low tables bearing bowls of lemons and pitchers of cold water. Jasmine grew along the balustrade. The scent of it, combined with the salt of the sea and the particular warmth of the Greek afternoon sun, was, Poirot admitted privately, not without its charm. His host had greeted him on that terrace with the practised warmth of a man accustomed to charming, important people. Alexandros Vardakis was perhaps 60, silver-haired, broad in the chest, with a handshake that communicated both strength and welcome. His face was deeply tanned, his teeth very white, and his eyes, Poirot noticed this at once, were the watchful grey of a man who had built an empire by observing what others overlooked. He owned ships, several hundred of them. He funded museums, opera houses, and a celebrated foundation for the restoration of Byzantine art. He was, by general agreement, one of the most cultivated, wealthy men in Europe. Monsieur Poirot. He had taken both of Poirot's hands in his. I am honoured, truly. A man who solves what cannot be solved. You are exactly the sort of mind this house requires. You are too kind, Monsieur Vardakis. Poirot had allowed himself to be installed in a chair, provided with an excellent glass of champagne, and introduced to the assembled company with the gratified attention one might give to a museum acquisition. He had noted with his customary precision the expression on Vardakis's face as he surveyed his guests. It was not entirely the expression of a host. It was the expression of a collector, possessive, subtly anxious, as if he feared that something, or someone, might be removed from his collection without his consent. The guests had been arranged on the terrace like elements of a composition. Helena Vardakis sat at the far end near the balustrade, a glass of champagne held between two fingers, in a manner that suggested she had been holding champagne glasses in that precise fashion for 30 years. She was still a remarkably handsome woman. Her cheekbones were architectural. Her dark hair was arranged with severe perfection. Her smile, when she deployed it, was flawless. But Poirot, watching her eyes behind the smile, thought of a room whose windows had been shuttered against the heat. She was Alexandros's former wife. She remained on the island, she remained at the table. And yet she was no longer, Poirot sensed, the centre of anything. Nearby, were as though positioned by a set designer who understood the principles of contrast, sat Céleste Armand. She was French, or presented herself as such. Her beauty was of the variety that made conversation difficult for those in close proximity. She laughed, and the laughter was musical. She tilted her head, and the gesture was graceful. She said very little of substance, and yet those around her leaned slightly inward, as flowers follow a light source. She was a celebrated actress, celebrated in the particular manner that meant one had heard her name more than one had seen her performances. Leo Markovitch sat at the table with an air of relaxed ease that Poirot found immediately suspicious. Ease of that quality was always constructed. He was Serbian in his middle 30s, and his fortune had appeared in the world of technology with a speed that suggested either remarkable brilliance or remarkable good fortune. His suit was Italian. His manners were impeccable. He spoke several languages without accent in any of them, which was, in Poirot's experience, the accomplishment of a man who had worked very hard to a race wherever he came from. Sophia Duarte passed through the terrace with the invisible efficiency of an excellent piece of machinery. She was Vardakis's personal assistant, slim, dark, quiet, dressed in a manner that was professional without being memorable. She carried a leather folder. She spoke briefly into Vardakis's ear and departed. Poirot watched her go. She controlled, he understood, the schedules, the gallery, the household accounts. She knew the passwords, the arrangements, the private transactions. She knew, in other words, everything. And then the portrait was unveiled. They had gathered in the gallery after dinner. The room was long and cool, its walls hung with works of significant value and considered taste. At the far end, draped in cream linen, something waited. Vardakis unveiled it himself. He drew the linen aside with a flourish that betrayed, beneath the collector's practiced restraint, a child's excitement. The room was silent for a moment. Then the young man said she was watching someone behind them, and Bellini explained the Flemish technique, and several guests laughed with the careful brightness of people who had felt something they did not wish to acknowledge. Poirot studied the painting with great attention. Then he studied the people studying the painting. He observed Bellini's proprietary satisfaction. He observed Nikos's studied indifference, which cost him considerable effort. He observed Leo Markovich's expression, which was too neutral, by precisely the degree that indicated active thought. He observed Helena Vardakis, who looked at the portrait as though recognizing something she had hoped never to see again. And then he observed Celeste Armand. She was looking at the portrait with an expression he could not immediately classify. Not admiration, not unease. Something older and more particular than either. Then her hand loosened around her glass. It fell. It shattered on the marble floor, and the sound of it was very loud in the quiet room. She apologized at once, beautifully, laughingly, and a servant appeared with extraordinary speed to collect the pieces. The moment dissolved. The conversation resumed. Someone asked Bellini another question about the authentication, but in the half-second before Celeste had looked away from the painting, Poirot had seen something else. He had seen her eyes move. Not to Vardakis, not to the ruined glass, not to the servants, but to Helena. And Helena had looked back. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, but Poirot, who had built his career on the observation of 2-second exchanges, filed it away with great care. The wine was excellent. The night air drifted in from the terrace, warm and scented with jasmine. Around him, beautiful, cultivated people discussed beautiful, cultivated things. Poirot set down his glass and tilted his egg-shaped head very slightly to one side. Something in this gathering, he thought, had the quality of a surface stretched too tightly over whatever lay beneath it. He hoped, for everyone's sake, that it would hold until morning. It did not. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Price of Everything. The body was discovered at 7:20 in the morning by a housemaid who had come to open the gallery shutters. She did not scream. She was a sensible woman from the village below, and she had worked for Alexandros Vardakis for 11 years, long enough to have lost most of her capacity for surprise where her employer was concerned. She set down her tray of cleaning cloths with great care, walked to the door of the gallery, and went to find Sophia Duarte. Poirot was on the terrace when the news reached him, taking his morning tisane with the methodical appreciation it deserved. The sea was a sheet of hammered silver in the early light, the sun not yet high enough to burn off the thin mist that clung to the water below the cliff. He had slept well, which pleased him. He had also, before sleeping, reviewed the events of the previous evening in the precise and orderly fashion he applied to all things, arranging the details like objects on a tray, examining each one, and replacing it exactly where he had found it. He was still, he admitted, uncertain what sort of tray he was dealing with. Sophia came to him first, which he found interesting. Not to Helena, who had been Vardakis's wife, not to Nikos, who was his son, to him. She stood before him with absolute stillness. Her face was composed. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and without inflection. Monsieur Poirot, I must ask you to come to the gallery." He came. Alexandros Vardakis sat in the velvet armchair at the far end of the room, the one positioned directly before the portrait. His chin rested on his chest at the angle of a man who had fallen asleep in his chair, which was, Poirot thought, the position in which he would have wished to be found had he any say in the matter. His right hand lay open in his lap. Beside him, on the low table, a crystal glass held a finger's worth of amber liquid. The smell of the brandy, rich, dark, faintly sweet, reached Poirot across 6 feet of marble floor. He did not touch anything. He stood in the doorway for a considerable moment, hands clasped before him, and looked. The portrait looked back, over his left shoulder, at something only it could see. "You have sent for a doctor," Poirot said. It was not a question. "Yes." Sophia had positioned herself slightly behind him and to the right. Her hands were folded before her in the manner of a woman accustomed to waiting for instructions. "And for the harbour police. There is a sergeant. He will come by boat." "That is correct." Poirot advanced 3 steps into the room. He studied the glass. He studied the position of the hands. He studied the expression on the dead man's face, which was one of extraordinary composure, even contentment, as though Vardakis had found, in his final moments, something entirely satisfactory to contemplate. There is no disturbance, no struggle. He did not attempt to rise. "He could not have been afraid, then," said Sophia. "No." Poirot turned his head very slightly to look at her. Or he did not see the danger until it was too late, which is a quite different thing. He paused. "The Armenian brandy. He was particular about it, your employer?" "He kept a private bottle. It was not served to guests." "And the decanter. Where is it kept?" "In the cabinet to the left of the gallery desk. The cabinet requires a key." She hesitated, the first hesitation he had observed from her. "I hold a key. Monsieur Vardakis held one. There are no others." Poirot absorbed this information without visible reaction and turned his attention back to the painting. In the early morning light, with the shutters still half closed and the shadows long across the marble, the woman in the portrait seemed, if anything, more alert than she had the previous evening. Her attention to that unseen presence beyond the viewer's shoulder appeared in this context to carry a slightly altered meaning. Someone, Poirot thought, had arranged this very carefully indeed. The guests assembled on the terrace at 8:30, summoned by Sophia with the quiet authority of a person who has managed crises before and found them, ultimately, manageable. They arrived in varying states of composure. Helena came in a black silk wrap that one suspected had been selected with some thought, her face arranged into an expression of grief that was technically flawless. She accepted coffee and asked no questions, which Poirot considered rather more revealing than questions would have been. Nikos arrived last, unshaven and pale, and sat apart from the others at the far end of the balustrade. He stared at the sea. He did not speak. When a servant offered coffee, he shook his head once, sharply, like a man refusing something he cannot name. Celeste descended the exterior staircase from the upper rooms, looking, as always, as though she had been arranged for an occasion. Her beauty this morning had a fragile, translucent quality that some might have attributed to distress. Poirot attributed it to a sleepless night and a considerable effort of will. She sat beside Leo Markovitch, which Poirot noted, and placed her hand briefly on his arm, which Poirot also noted. Leo received the gesture with a calm so thorough it suggested he had been expecting it. Bellini appeared from the direction of the library, which Poirot found curious, since the library was in the opposite direction from his guest room. He carried his reading glasses in one hand and wore the expression of a man whose thoughts are moving very quickly behind an entirely stationary face. Dim Poirot waited until the coffee had been poured and the first silence had settled before he spoke. "I regret to inform you," he said pleasantly, "that it will not be possible for any person to leave the island today. I have spoken with the harbour sergeant, who is in agreement. There are questions to be answered. There is, I believe, a great deal to be understood." He permitted himself a small pause. "I trust no one finds this inconvenient." Nobody said they found it inconvenient, which was, in its way, the most informative thing that had happened all morning. It was Bellini who broke the silence, as Poirot had suspected it would be. "The portrait," Bellini said, "given the circumstances being what they are, I wonder whether the portrait might not be more securely housed." "The portrait," said Poirot, "will remain exactly where it is." He looked at Bellini with an expression of mild interest. "You are concerned for it, Monsieur Bellini. I authenticated it. There is a professional responsibility." "Naturally." Poirot reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small notebook, very clean, its pages unlined. "You authenticated the work 3 months ago, I believe. The sale was finalized 5 weeks later. Tell me, was it your understanding that Monsieur Vardakis financed the purchase entirely?" Bellini's expression did not alter by very much, merely by enough. Of course, he was the buyer. Quite so, he was the buyer. Poirot wrote something in the notebook, though what he wrote was visible to no one. "And the price, Monsieur Bellini. You are content to confirm 12 million euros? That was the agreed sum." It was. Remarkable. Poirot closed the notebook with a small, satisfied sound and returned it to his pocket. A very great deal of money for a painter of whom most people have not heard. Bellini's jaw tightened, fractionally. Great art does not require a famous signature. "But it often requires a famous buyer," said Poirot, and left the observation precisely where it was. He spent the remainder of the morning in what he described when Helena asked him pointedly what he was doing, as a simple promenade. He examined the gallery twice more, once alone and once in the company of the harbour sergeant, a stout and sensible man named Papadimitriou, who carried a notebook of his own and shared Poirot's view that things should be written down. He examined the brandy cabinet, the key that Sophia provided, and the faint, circular ring of dried liquid on the lower shelf that suggested the decanter had been removed and replaced, not once, but twice, within recent days. He examined the gallery records which Sophia produced with quiet efficiency, and he found within them the payment trail that stopped him for a full minute, quite still, looking at nothing in particular. Half the purchase price had come from Vardakis. The remaining 6 million euros traced through 3 subsidiaries to an account registered in Luxembourg under a corporate name that resolved, when one looked carefully enough, to precisely nothing at all. Someone had paid half the cost of this painting and received, in exchange, no ownership, no public credit, and no apparent benefit of any kind. Unless, Poirot thought, now turning away from the records and walking slowly back toward the terrace, the benefit was something the painting's presence at the villa was intended to enable, or to conceal. The afternoon light lay in long golden slabs across the marble floor of the gallery. At the far end of the room, the woman in the portrait maintained her patient, lateral vigil, attending to her invisible companion with an air of complete and unhurried certainty, as if she had known from the beginning precisely how this would end. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, The Beautiful Liars. It is a curious feature of sudden death that it does not, as one might expect, simplify people. It complicates them enormously. Poirot had observed this phenomenon across 40 years of professional life, in English country houses and continental hotels, and once, memorably, on a train that had no business stopping where it did. The presence of a corpse did not strip away pretense. It layered on new pretense, richer and more various than before, the way a painter covers an unsatisfactory canvas not by scraping it clean, but by applying fresh paint over the old, hoping the original errors will not show through. They always showed through, in the end. He began with Bellini because Bellini was the one who most wished to be elsewhere. They sat in the library, where the books were arranged with the geometric precision of a man who had bought them for their spines rather than their contents. A ceiling fan turned overhead, moving the warm air without cooling it. Bellini sat with his legs crossed and his reading glasses folded in his hands. The image of a cultured man cooperating graciously with an irritating formality. "You will want to know where I was," Bellini said. Among other things, Poirot had taken the chair opposite and now regarded the Italian with the mild, attentive expression that several people over the years had made the mistake of interpreting as benevolence. But let us begin rather with the portrait. You authenticated it. A work by a painter of the second rank, sold for a sum that would dignify a Titian. How did you arrive at your valuation, Monsieur Bellini? Bellini's chin came up slightly. Provenance, condition, the intrinsic quality of the work. These are not my opinions. They are established criteria. The provenance, yes. Poirot appeared to consider this with great respect. A painting discovered in a private collection in Thessaloniki. The collector, a widow, I believe, who has since died. How very convenient for the authentication. It is not unusual for provenance to rely on the testimony of those who are no longer living. No, Poirot agreed pleasantly. It is not unusual at all. Which is, one might say, rather the point. He folded his own hands in his lap, the mirror image of Bellini's posture, which caused the Italian a moment of inexplicable discomfort. I am interested also in the co-payment. 6 million euros from an anonymous account. You were unaware of this arrangement? Completely. The word was emphatic, perhaps too emphatic. And had you been aware, had someone approached you, let us say, and proposed such an arrangement, you would have found it irregular. Bellini looked at him steadily. I would have found it extremely irregular. But not, said Poirot, entirely without precedent in your experience. The ceiling fan turned. A fly traversed the window. Bellini unfolded his glasses and folded them again. I think, he said at last, that you should speak to the others. Poirot thanked him warmly and moved on. He found Leo Markovitch on the lower terrace, the narrow one that ran along the cliff's eastern edge, and was used in ordinary times for nothing more consequential than watching the fishing boats. Leo was standing at the stone parapet with his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking at the sea with the focused attention of a man who is not looking at the sea at all. Monsieur Markovitch. Poirot joined him at the parapet and looked at the sea himself for a moment. It was, he had to concede, a very fine sea. I understand that you and Monsieur Vardakis had a professional association some years ago. Leo glanced sideways. He was an early investor in my first company, yes. A significant investor? Significant enough. A pause. I repaid him, with considerable interest. The association ended. These things rarely end, Poirot observed in the tone of a man sharing a regrettable fact about weather. They transform, perhaps. They become something else. But the original transaction, it leaves its mark, non? A man who has funded another man's beginning is not easily forgotten. Leo was quiet for a moment. Below the cliff, the sea moved in long, slow respirations. Vardakis was a man who held his investments close, he said finally. Not only the financial ones. He liked to know that people, certain people, remained, or shall we say, cognizant of what they owed him. He reminded you of the debt. Periodically. And this weekend, Poirot said. Was it such a reminder? Leo turned from the parapet and looked at him directly for the first time. He had good eyes, intelligent, watchful, with the slightly flat quality of a man who had trained himself not to reveal the moment of decision. He invited me, Leo said. I came. One does. It was, Poirot reflected, walking back up the steps toward the main terrace. A more honest answer than most people would have given, and therefore, in its own way, more alarming than a lie. Helena Vardakis received him in her rooms, which occupied the western wing of the villa, and were decorated with the cool, impersonal elegance of someone who has arranged a space to be admired rather than inhabited. She had changed since the morning into a dress of dove grey, and she sat very straight in a chair by the window, her hands resting on her knees, her face composed into what Poirot recognized as the dignified expression of a woman who had been composing her face for a very long time. You will ask about the will, she said before he had settled himself. Eventually, said Poirot. First, I should like to ask about the portrait. This fractured her composure very briefly and very precisely in the manner of a hairline crack appearing in good porcelain. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise. What about it? Last evening, when the linen was drawn aside, you looked at the painting with an expression I found most interesting. Not curiosity, not admiration. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Recognition, madame. You recognize something. Helena was silent for 4 full seconds. Then she said with great care, Alexandros had a habit of acquiring things that had histories he did not fully understand. I have occasionally recognized the consequences of that habit. That is a very elegant answer, Poirot said approvingly. I wonder if you might be persuaded to provide a slightly more specific one. No, said Helena. I don't think I might, not yet. He accepted this with good grace. In his experience, not yet was frequently more useful than an immediate answer, because it meant the person had already decided to tell him eventually, and was merely organizing their reasons. He saved Celeste Armand for last. She was in the garden, which occupied a series of terraced levels below the villa's eastern face, planted with olive trees and oleander and paths of pale gravel. She was sitting on a stone bench in the shade, her hands around a glass of water, her celebrated face turned toward the middle distance with an expression of absolute, unperformed stillness. In repose, without the machinery of charm in operation, she looked younger and also, somehow, more real. less the actress and more the person who had decided, at some point in a difficult life, to become one. "You have been speaking to everyone," she said, when Poirot settled himself on the bench beside her. "It's my method." "And what do people tell you?" "Less than they intend," said Poirot, "and rather more than they suppose." He looked at the oleander, which was flowering extravagantly in the heat, its pink clusters almost aggressive in their colour. "Mademoiselle Armande, last evening you dropped your glass. You looked at the portrait, and you looked at Madame Vardakis, and you dropped your glass. I would very much like to understand the connection." Celeste looked down at the water in her hands. Her fingers, Poirot noticed, were not entirely steady. "I was startled," she said, "by the painting. By the painting." She lifted her eyes. They were very clear, very blue, and presently very guarded. "It reminded me of someone, a person from a very long time ago. It was a surprise, that is all, an unpleasant surprise." "And Madame Vardakis? She shared your surprise?" "Helena is a woman who has many private reactions to many things." The charm was assembling itself again as she spoke, returning to her face like colour returning to a room when the shutters are opened. "Well, she is not easy to read." "No," Poirot agreed. "But then, mademoiselle, neither are you." He rose, thanked her for her time, and walked back toward the villa through the terraced garden, past the olive trees and the extravagant oleander, turning over in his mind the particular texture of what she had not said. The painting reminded her of someone from a long time ago. Not something, someone. And the word she had begun, it reminded me of, had not been going toward painting at all. It had been going somewhere quite different before she corrected it. Poirot paused on the path and looked back at the bench, where Celeste sat alone with her glass of water, her composure now fully restored, her face once again its own beautiful, impenetrable mask. Behind her, through the gallery window, the portrait was just visible in the shadowed interior. Watching. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. What Money Cannot Buy. The harbour sergeant arrived at 2:30 with a doctor, a constable, and an expression of profound reluctance. Sergeant Papadimitriou was a man who had spent 22 years policing an island without motor cars, where the most serious matters that came before him were disputes about fishing boundaries and the occasional theft of livestock. He had brought his notebook, as Poirot had observed, and he wrote in it with the careful application of a man for whom the act of writing represented official commitment, not to be undertaken lightly. He and Poirot had reached, by the end of the morning, a working arrangement of mutual respect founded on the understanding that Papadimitriou would manage the formal requirements of Greek law, and Poirot would manage everything else. The doctor confirmed what Poirot had already suspected. The preliminary examination indicated poisoning. The specific substance would require laboratory analysis, for which the body would need to travel to Athens. Papadimitriou wrote all of this down. He also wrote down the names of the guests, their nationalities and their room locations, and then looked at the list with the expression of a man who has found an unexpected item in his shopping. "A Belgian detective," he said, reading from the notebook. "Also a guest." "Also a guest," Poirot confirmed. Papadimitriou looked at him for a moment. "This is convenient," he said, though his tone left the nature of the convenience pleasingly ambiguous. After the official party had completed its work and departed with appropriate solemnity, Poirot returned to the gallery. The velvet armchair had been removed. The brandy glass had been taken for analysis. The cabinet stood closed, its key in Papadimitriou's possession. The portrait remained, as Poirot had insisted, undisturbed. He stood before it for rather a long time. There was, he had always believed, something to be learned from what a man chose to look at in the last hours of his life. Vardakis had come to this room, voluntarily since there was no sign of compulsion, poured himself a measure of brandy from a bottle only he and his assistant could access, settled himself in the chair he reserved for his most private contemplations, and sat down to look at a painting he had owned for 3 weeks. Not at the sea, not at the accumulated masterworks that lined the rest of the gallery. At this particular painting by this particular obscure hand, purchased under circumstances that grew, the more Poirot examined them, steadily less explicable. He thought about what Leo Markovitch had said about the man who held his investments close. He thought about what Helena had almost said and then elected not to. He thought about Celeste's corrected sentence. Then he turned the painting carefully away from the wall and looked at its reverse. The stretcher was old, the canvas adequately aged, the back bearing the customary accretions of dust and small inscriptions that authenticated works accumulated across a century. All of it was consistent with Bellini's stated provenance. All of it, Poirot thought, precisely and almost too consistently so. He replaced the painting and went to find Nikos. The young man had not moved far from where Poirot had last observed him. He had, however, moved inside, and was sitting in the small salon at the villa's north end, the room furthest from the gallery, with a bottle of wine he had largely converted into an absinthe. He looked up when Poirot entered and did not attempt an expression. This Poirot found rather refreshing. "Sit down," Nikos said, which was not, strictly, his invitation to offer. Poirot sat anyway. "You are not grieving," Poirot said after a moment. Nikos looked at the window. "I am grieving in the way that you grieve for something you lost a long time ago. My father and I were—" He stopped, started again. He was a man who found objects more comprehensible than people. I was always, to him, a somewhat disappointing object. "He was planning to remarry," Poirot said. Nikos reached for the bottle and found it empty. He regarded it without surprise. "He told me 4 months ago. He thought I would be pleased for him." A short, humourless sound that was not quite a laugh. "She is 3 years older than I am, or says she is." "You doubted her stated age?" "I doubted a great many things about Celeste Armand." He set the bottle down with precision. "But Celeste is very beautiful, and my father was 60, and perhaps that is sufficient explanation." "You cared for her yourself," Poirot said, gently but directly. Nikos was quiet long enough that the ceiling fan completed several full rotations. "I thought I did. One confuses proximity with feeling sometimes. She was always elsewhere, even when she was in the room." He looked at Poirot with the suddenly direct gaze of a young man who has drunk just enough to mistake candour for wisdom. "She didn't want my father either, you know. She wanted something else entirely, and my father was a door she thought might open it." "What sort of door?" "Freedom," Nikos said, and then appeared to regret it. He looked away. "She used the word once. I thought she meant his money. Now I am not sure what she meant." Poirot thanked him and left him to what remained of his afternoon. He had one further conversation before dinner, and it was the one he had been arranging in his mind since shortly after breakfast. Sofia Duarte was at her desk in the small estate office adjacent to the kitchen corridor when he knocked. She admitted him without hesitation, which meant she had been expecting him, which meant she was considerably more intelligent than her invisible, efficient surface suggested. She sat behind the desk with her hands folded on it, the leather folder closed beside her, and she watched him take the chair opposite with the composed attentiveness of a woman who has decided to be honest about most things and is carefully identifying which things to exempt. "The poison," Poirot began, "will prove, I believe, to derive from a plant alkaloid of considerable rarity, not something one purchases at a pharmacy, not something one finds by accident." He settled more comfortably in the chair. Someone in this household had access to such knowledge. The gallery records, the collection inventories, the correspondence with suppliers. All of this passes through your office. It does. And does any such correspondence include botanical suppliers, rare plant collectors, anything of that nature? Sophia was still for a moment. Monsieur Vardakis maintained a subscription with a horticultural importer in Lisbon. Rare specimens for the lower garden. I placed the orders on his behalf. She paused. "I can provide the correspondence. If you please." She opened a desk drawer and produced, without searching for it, a folder she had clearly prepared in advance. She placed it before him on the desk. He opened it. He read. He did not allow his face to do anything in particular, which required a small effort of discipline. Because the third invoice in the folder was from a specialist importer of South American botanical specimens, dated 7 weeks earlier, and included in the itemized list, under a Latin name of some length, a plant that Poirot recognized from a monograph he had read some years ago on the subject of obscure alkaloid poisons. He closed the folder. He looked at Sophia. She looked back at him with perfect steadiness. "You prepared this folder this morning," he said. "Yes." "Before I asked to see you." "Yes." He considered her. She was, he thought, either completely innocent or completely remarkable, and in his experience these two qualities were not always as distinct as they appeared. "Mademoiselle Duarte, you have worked for Alexandros Vardakis for how long?" 6 years. "And you were content? How in that position?" Something shifted in her expression. "Not much, barely enough to measure." "I was competent in that position," she said. "Contentment is a different matter." It was, Poirot reflected, the most personal thing she had said, and she had chosen, with great precision, to say it now in response to that particular question, immediately after placing before him a document that implicated her access to the means of murder. He picked up the folder. He thanked her. He walked slowly back along the corridor toward the terrace, turning the folder in his hands, and thought about the distinction between a woman who provides evidence against herself because she is innocent and a woman who provides evidence against herself because she is remarkably clever. The sun was dropping toward the western ridge of the island. The sea below the cliff had turned from silver to a deep, burning amber, and the shadows across the terrace were long and cool. From somewhere in the lower garden came the faint sound of the oleander moving in the evening breeze. Poirot stood at the terrace balustrade and looked at the horizon and allowed himself for just a moment the particular pleasure of a mind working well in the presence of a problem that was beginning, at last, to show him its true shape. It was not yet the complete shape, but it was, unmistakably, the outline of something real. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Hidden Economy. Dinner that evening was a strained and peculiar affair. The cook, a stout Athenian woman named Despina, who had been with the villa for 9 years and considered its social arrangements none of her concern, produced a meal of considerable excellence regardless. There was cold soup and grilled fish and a salad of tomatoes and herbs that tasted precisely of the island. The wine was excellent. Nobody noticed any of it. They sat at the long table on the upper terrace, where they had dined the previous evening in the easy, performed warmth of people who are enjoying being seen to enjoy themselves. Tonight, the performance had been cancelled and the stage left bare. Bellini spoke about a forthcoming exhibition in Milan, with the determined brightness of a man filling silence because he cannot bear what the silence contains. Nikos ate nothing and left early. Leo poured wine for Celeste with a quiet solicitude that Poirot observed from the far end of the table, noting the small, grateful pressure of her fingers on the stem of her glass in response. Helena ate with perfect appetite and said almost nothing, which was, at a table where everyone else was either performing or retreating, its own form of statement. Poirot ate everything and watched all of them. Afterwards, when the others had dispersed to their rooms or to the dark corners of the terrace where the night-blooming jasmine made the air almost unbearably sweet, he sat alone in the salon with the botanical correspondence from Sophia's folder and a cup of herbal tea, and he read everything twice. The invoice was unambiguous. The plant in question, Poirot had by now confirmed the identification against a reference volume from Vardakis's well-appointed library, produced in concentrated preparation an alkaloid with specific and well-documented toxic properties. Colourless, largely tasteless when dissolved, lethal in quantities that would fill a thimble. It was, in every material respect, the ideal substance for a murder that was intended to appear, at first consideration, as the natural death of an elderly man of sedentary habits and considerable appetites. The order had been placed in Sophia's name, the delivery had been receipted in Sophia's name, and Sophia had placed the folder in his hands before he had asked for it. Poirot set down his tea and considered the specific geometry of this. A guilty person, wishing to deflect suspicion, might provide evidence that implicated others. A guilty person of exceptional intelligence might provide evidence that implicated herself, calculating that the very transparency of the gesture would read as innocence. But a truly innocent person, who had ordered a plant on routine horticultural instructions and only recognized its significance upon hearing that her employer had been poisoned, might also provide the correspondence immediately and without prompting, for the straightforward reason that innocent people rarely understand how incriminating straightforwardness appears. The difficulty was that all three of these people looked, from the outside, identical. He slept on the question and rose early, and by 7 o'clock he was on the lower terrace with his tisane, watching the fishing boats move across the flat morning water far below. He had decided in the particular clear interval between sleep and full waking, which was in his experience the most productive quarter hour of any investigation, that what he required was not more evidence but a different quality of attention. He had been looking these past 2 days at what the guests chose to show him. It was time to look at what they showed each other when they believed they were unobserved. He did not wait long. At 7:30, Celeste Armand came down the exterior staircase from the upper rooms in a light wrap. her hair loose, moving quietly in the manner of a person who does not wish to be seen. She crossed the upper terrace and descended the narrow steps to the garden. Poirot, who was obscured from the staircase by the angle of the awning support, watched her go. He counted to 30 and followed at a distance that would, in the narrow terrace lanes of the garden, have been impractical to maintain. But the lower garden was open enough to allow it. He reached the olive grove in time to see her arrive at the stone bench where she had sat the previous afternoon. She was not alone. Sophia Duarte was already there. Poirot stopped behind the last olive tree before the path opened onto the bench, at a distance of perhaps 8 meters, close enough to observe the quality of the exchange, if not its precise content. What he observed required no words to interpret. The two women sat close together on the stone bench, closer than colleagues, closer than the acquaintances they had presented themselves as being. Sophia was speaking quietly and rapidly. Celeste was listening with her head bowed, and when Sophia stopped speaking, Celeste looked up and said something short and definite. Then Sophia placed her hand over Celeste's and held it, and Celeste did not pull away. The gesture lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then they separated smoothly, and Sophia rose and walked back up the garden path by the alternative route, the one that returned to the villa through the kitchen corridor, and Celeste remained on the bench with her hands in her lap and her face, once again, quite still. Poirot retreated before either of them could discover his presence. He was back on the lower terrace with his, now cold, tisane, when Leo Markovitch appeared at the terrace door. Leo was already dressed with his customary precision and looked as though he had slept, if not well, at least efficiently. Monsieur Poirot. He took the chair across the low table without being invited, which told Poirot something about his state of mind. The casual confidence of the terrace was gone this morning. He looked like a man who had spent the night accounting for things. "I should like to tell you something that I did not tell you yesterday." "I am gratified," said Poirot, "that you have reached this decision." Leo looked at the sea. "Vardakis did not merely invest in my first company. When the company ran into regulatory difficulties, certain questions about data practices, he resolved them. He had connections. The questions went away." He paused. "The price of that resolution was a continuing arrangement, certain data, certain access, nothing that would satisfy a prosecutor, everything that would satisfy a blackmailer. He held this over you for 6 years. No heat in the voice. The tone of a man reporting a condition of weather. This weekend was not, as I suggested yesterday, merely a social invitation. He wished to renegotiate the terms. The arrangement had become, in his view, insufficiently valuable. He wanted something more substantial. And you refused? I had not yet refused or agreed. He was killed before the conversation concluded. Leo looked at him directly. I am telling you this because you will discover it anyway, and because I did not kill him. I had excellent reasons not to. A dead Vardakis cannot unexpose what a living one was paid to conceal. It was, Poirot thought, a very lucid analysis of self-interest. Whether it was also true was, of course, an entirely separate question. One further thing, Leo said, and produced from his jacket pocket a folded sheet of paper, which he placed on the table between them. This was under my door this morning. Poirot unfolded it. It was a single line, a handwritten in a careful, upright script on plain white paper. It read, "Ask Bellini what he forged." There was no signature. Poirot refolded the paper along its original crease and placed it in his own breast pocket. He thanked Leo Markovitch, who rose and went inside with the relieved yet watchful air of a man who has made a confession and is uncertain whether it has improved his position. Then Poirot sat for a while with his cold tisane and the sound of the sea, turning the note over in his mind. The handwriting was careful, too careful. The deliberate uprightness of a person suppressing their natural hand. The paper was the plain white stock used throughout the villa's guest rooms. The message was specific enough to be credible and vague enough to be deniable. Someone wished him to look more closely at Bellini. The question was whether they wished this because it was true, or because they very much needed him to be looking somewhere other than where the truth actually resided. In Poirot's experience, anonymous notes of this variety were rarely acts of selfless civic assistance. They were, almost invariably, a move in a game that was already in progress. He rose, straightened his cuffs with the automatic precision of long habit, and went to find Bellini. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Mask of Gold. Bellini was in the gallery. This was, on reflection, either entirely natural or deeply suspicious, and the distance between those two interpretations was precisely the difficulty Poirot had been navigating since the previous morning. The Italian stood before the portrait, with his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted at the angle of professional assessment, examining the painting with the absorbed concentration of a man who is either admiring his work or calculating what it may yet cost him. He heard Poirot's footsteps on the marble and did not turn around immediately, which was itself a kind of message. "You have come about the note," Bellini said to the painting. Poirot came to stand beside him. They regarded the portrait together for a moment, in the manner of two museum visitors who have independently arrived at the same exhibit and are now committed to a shared experience neither quite intended. "You know about the note," Poirot said. "I know that someone in this house wishes you to scrutinize me more closely." Bellini turned finally, with the measured unhurriedness of a man who has made a decision and is now implementing it. Up close in the morning light, without the flattering warmth of the previous evening's lamps, he looked older. There were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a night spent in company with difficult thoughts. "I have been waiting for you to come, Monsieur Poirot, because there are things I should have told you yesterday and did not." "There are always such things," Poirot said equably. "Please continue." Bellini moved to the gallery desk, the one beside the locked cabinet Poirot noted, and sat on its edge with the slightly theatrical informality of a man who has decided that studied ease will serve him better than rigidity. "The authentication," he said. "It is not entirely false. The painting is genuinely old. The canvas, the pigments, the ground, all consistent with the 19th century. The technique is credible for the period. What I cannot prove—" He stopped, began again with rather less elegance. "What I cannot prove to the standard I should have required is the attribution. The painter. Vasiliou is a real figure. He worked in Athens and the islands in the 1870s and 1880s. There are documented works. The style of this painting is consistent with his hand." Bellini's own hands moved in a brief, expressive gesture. But the direct provenance, the chain of ownership from his studio to the Thessaloniki collection, has gaps. I papered over them. I should not have done so. "And the woman in the painting," Poirot said. "Her identity was not established." Bellini looked at him sharply. It is a portrait of an unknown subject. That is not unusual for the period. No, Poirot agreed. But it is unusual for a collector of Vardakis's sophistication to pay 12 million euros for an unsigned attribution with gaps in its provenance, without requiring rather more rigorous documentation. Unless, he added, with the mild air of a man thinking aloud, the value of the painting lay not in its artistic merit but in something else entirely. The silence that followed was of the productive variety. Bellini looked at the floor. He looked at the portrait. He looked finally at Poirot, with the exhausted expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough to accept that he must put it down. "Someone approached me 14 months ago," he said. "A representative. I was not told the principal's name. They had an old painting, genuinely old, as I said, and they required a documented attribution and a legitimate sale to a credible buyer. They had already identified Vardakis as the buyer. They required my name on the authentication. And in return, enough money to keep my gallery solvent for 3 years." He said it without self-pity, which Poirot found on the whole more credible than remorse would have been. "My gallery has been in difficulties. Vardakis knew this. He had sustained me with purchases for several years, but those purchases had become conditional. He liked people to need him, as I believe you have already discovered. The representative who approached you, a man or a woman?" Bellini hesitated. "A woman, young, dark. I was not given a name and I did not ask for one." Poirot absorbed this without visible agitation, though something in the vicinity of his grey cells performed a small, precise movement, like a key turning in a well-oiled lock. He asked 2 further questions about the representative, her approximate age, her manner of speech, and received answers that confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. Then he thanked Bellini, who looked marginally less wretched for having spoken, and walked to the far end of the gallery. He stood before the portrait for a long time. The anonymous co-payment, the commissioned authentication, the representative who had approached Bellini and arranged the entire transaction, the plant ordered from Lisbon, the folder produced without being asked for, the note under Leo's door, written in a suppressed hand. He reached forward and with great care lifted the portrait from its hanging. He had looked at the reverse the previous day and found it consistent. Too consistently so, he had thought, though the thought had not yet fully resolved. He looked again now, more slowly, with the particular attention that his little grey cells were directing him to apply to things he had already seen but not yet fully understood. The stretcher bar, the aged canvas, the accumulated marks of decades, all as before. But in the lower right corner of the reverse, where the canvas wrapped around the wooden frame, he found something he had not looked for the first time, because he had not yet known to look for it. A small section of the canvas had been very neatly separated from the stretcher bar and reattached, the tacks minute and precise, the re-stretching executed with professional skill. He pressed the canvas gently, or something behind it, between canvas and stretcher, gave fractionally under his fingertip. Something was there. He did not remove it, not yet. He replaced the painting on its hook with the same care with which he had lifted it, and stepped back, and looked at it from the front. The woman looked past him at her invisible companion. Poirot looked back at her and thought about what a painting might conceal that would be worth 6 million euros to keep hidden, worth a forged authentication to legitimize, worth a dead man to protect. He was still considering this when Helena Vardakis appeared in the gallery doorway. She was not, he thought, surprised to find him here. She stood for a moment in the threshold, and her expression had changed since their conversation the previous afternoon. The not yet had resolved into something. Decision, perhaps, or the particular exhaustion that precedes it. "You have been looking at the back of the painting," she said. "I have." "Then you have found it, or you soon will." She came into the room and stopped several feet from him, her arms crossed at her waist in the posture of a woman bracing against cold air in a warm room. "Alexandros told me about it 3 months ago, when he told me he intended to marry Celeste." A brief pause. "He told me, I think, because he wished me to understand that his position was unassailable, that whatever I might threaten or attempt, he was protected." "What is behind the canvas, madame?" "Documentation," Helena said. "Records of transactions that would destroy several people of considerable standing in 3 countries. Our Alexandros collected leverage the way other men collect paintings." She looked at the portrait with the expression Poirot had clocked on the night of the unveiling. Recognition, and beneath it, something colder. The painting was chosen because it was the ideal hiding place. A recently acquired work, legitimate provenance apparently. No reason for anyone to examine it closely. "But you recognize the woman in the painting," Poirot said. Helena was quiet for a moment. "The woman in the painting," she said carefully, "resembles someone I encountered once many years ago. A young woman in a provincial theatre in Lyon. I was there with Alexandros. He pointed her out. He said she was talented." She looked at Poirot. "I had forgotten her entirely until that canvas was unveiled." "And Celeste?" Helena's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Celeste," she said, "recognized the woman too. That much was evident. What the connection is, I cannot tell you." She moved toward the door and stopped. "But I will tell you this, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever Celeste Armand is and whatever she has done, I do not believe she killed Alexandros. She had more reason than most to wish him alive." A beat. Alive and unmarried are, of course, 2 different things. She left. Poirot stood alone in the gallery with the portrait and the hidden documentation and the accumulated weight of what he now knew, sorting it with the unhurried precision of a man arranging objects on a tray. Most of the objects were now in their correct positions. One remained out of place. The motive he had been examining was the wrong shape for the crime. He had known this obscurely, and since the previous evening and Helena's words had crystallized the discomfort into something he could finally name. He looked at the portrait one last time. The woman in the painting had been watching all of this from the beginning. From before the beginning, in a sense, before the guests arrived, before Vardakis died, before the brandy was poured. She had been watching and waiting, with the patience of someone who already knew how it would end. Poirot found that he was beginning to share her confidence. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Worthless Thing. There is a moment in every investigation, Poirot had long ago observed, when the case stops being a collection of separate facts and becomes, instead, a single fact viewed from multiple angles simultaneously. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, usually in the late afternoon, when the light is changing and the mind has exhausted its more obvious avenues and settled, without fanfare into the deeper stillness where clarity lives. That moment arrived for Poirot at 20 minutes past 4 on the third afternoon after the death of Alexandros Vardakis, while he was standing in the corridor outside the estate office, listening to the particular quality of silence that followed Sophia Duarte closing her door. He had not knocked. He had been about to, and then had not. And the question of why he had not occupied him for several minutes as he stood in the corridor with the sea light falling through the window at its end, turning over the accumulated evidence in the manner of a jeweller turning a stone to find the facet that best catches the light. On the motive he had been building, financial, material, the obvious architecture of inheritance and gain, was wrong. Helena had said so with her characteristic precision, though she had been speaking of Celeste. Poirot extended the observation. It applied equally, in fact rather more exactly, to the person he now believed had committed the murder. Sophia Duarte had worked for Alexandros Vardakis for 6 years. She controlled his household, managed his accounts, placed his orders, and knew his secrets. In 6 years of such proximity, she would have learned a great many things that a man like Vardakis intended his assistants to know, and a great many more that he did not. She would have learned, for instance, the contents of his correspondence, the nature of his leverage over his guests, the specific documentation he kept hidden behind a canvas that she had helped him select, identify, and install. She would have learned, too, the particular cruelty of watching a man plan to marry a woman he intended to own. Poirot knocked. She admitted him immediately, as before. She was at her desk, the leather folder gone, replaced by a set of household accounts she had apparently been reviewing with the methodical application of someone who finds arithmetic calming. She looked at him with the expression he had by now catalogued precisely. Composed, watchful, and beneath both of these, something very old and very tired. "Mademoiselle Duarte," Poirot said, settling into the chair, "I should like you to tell me about the theatre in Lyon." The accounts remained open on the desk. Sophia's pen did not move. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than innocence required. "I do not know what you mean," she said. Her voice was steady. Her voice, Poirot had observed, was always steady. It was one of the things about her that had taken him longer than it should have to recognize as a form of effort rather than a natural condition. "I think that you do." He was not unkind. Monsieur Vardakis and his wife, his former wife, attended a theatrical performance in Lyon some years ago. A young woman in the company attracted his attention, a young woman who was, I believe, performing under a name other than the one on her birth certificate. He paused. As was her companion. The pen was set down. Very carefully, with the precise deliberateness of someone ensuring that their hands have something to do. "Celeste Armand is not her real name," Poirot continued. "I do not know the name she was born with, and it is not, for my present purposes, important. What is important is that the woman in the portrait, the painting that Vardakis was so determined to acquire and install in his private gallery, bears a resemblance to someone both you and Celeste knew from a time before Villa Calypso, before the actress and the efficient assistant, before the reinventions you each undertook with such thoroughness." He looked at her quietly. The portrait was painted in the 1870s. The woman in it cannot naturally be the person you knew. But a family resemblance, a grandmother, a great-aunt, This is possible. And it was enough to recognize. Sophia was looking at the middle distance in the manner of a person reviewing a decision they have already made and finding on this review that it holds. Vardakis found out, Poirot said. Not about the painting. He does not appear to have made the connection you and Celeste made. But he found out something else. About Celeste. About what she was before she became who she is now. And he intended to use it. He intended to use everything, Sophia said. It was the first thing she had said that was not a deflection, and the flatness of it, the absence of any particular emotion, was more expressive than anger would have been. It was the only relationship he understood. You acquire something. You establish its value. You ensure that the person it belongs to knows you have it. She looked at Poirot directly. He was going to marry her. He told me this with great satisfaction, as though it were a kindness, as though the marriage would resolve everything. A pause. It would have resolved nothing. It would have made it permanent. You ordered the plant from Lisbon, Poirot said. I place all the horticultural orders. I have done for 3 years. This particular order was placed 8 weeks ago, before the announcement of the engagement, before this weekend was arranged. He watched her. You had been considering it for some time. Sophia looked at her hands on the desk. They were, he noticed for the first time, not entirely steady. The composure was intact, but composure, he had learned, was a structure, and structures under sufficient pressure showed their seams. I ordered a number of specimens that season, she said, for the lower garden. Oui, and one specimen in particular was not, in fact, delivered to the lower garden. It went to the estate office. I confirmed this morning with Despina, who knows the disposition of every item that arrives at this villa, and whose memory for such things is, I may say, remarkable. He said it gently. It was not, at this stage, a kindness he intended as comfort. It was simply his habit to be gentle at the moments that required it most. The photograph, he said, behind the portrait. I have not yet removed it, but I believe I will find it there. A photograph of 2 young women in a provincial theatre. You placed it there, not to conceal it precisely, to keep it close, and in the only place in this house that was, in a sense, yours to manage. The silence this time was different in quality from the others. It had a texture to it, the texture of something that has been held in place by great effort and has, at last, been released from the obligation. She would never have been free, Sophia said. The voice was still quiet, but the steadiness had changed its nature. It was no longer the steadiness of control, but the steadiness of something that has come to rest. He would have married her, and she would have disappeared into him, the way everything he touched disappeared into him eventually. He would have owned her history, her name, her future. Every morning she would have woken in his house and known that he knew, and that he was content, and that there was no door left. She paused. I could not permit it. You loved her, Poirot said, for a very long time. Simply, without adornment. The most honest sentence she had spoken in 3 days. Poirot sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the sea was turning its customary late afternoon gold, indifferent and magnificent. The note to Monsieur Markovitch, he said. That was you also. I thought it might occupy you for a day or 2. The ghost of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but its distant relation. "You are not easily occupied, Monsieur Poirot." "Non," he agreed. "It is, I confess, one of my less convenient qualities." He rose and stood for a moment, and looked at her with the expression that those who knew him well recognized as the one he wore when a case had concluded, and the conclusion gave him no pleasure whatsoever. "I must ask you to remain in your room this evening, mademoiselle. I will speak with Sergeant Papadimitriou." Sophia nodded once. She looked, he thought, neither relieved nor afraid. She looked like someone who has finished a very long piece of work and set it aside, and is now simply waiting to discover what comes next. He paused in the doorway. There was one thing more, not necessary, but true, and he was a man who had always believed that truth, where it could be offered without harm, should be. "The documentation behind the canvas," he said. "I will ensure that it is delivered to the appropriate authorities. The hold that Vardakis maintained over several people in this house will not survive his death." He regarded her. "You did not think of that, perhaps?" "No," Sophia said. "I did not think of it." She looked at her hands. "I thought of very little except Celeste." Poirot left her there with the closed accounts and the afternoon light and the austere simplicity of a woman who had done a terrible thing, for a reason she did not find, even now, entirely wrong. He walked back along the corridor towards the terrace, and the weight he carried had nothing to do with the solution, and everything to do with the truth he had always known about the business of murder. It was never about the crime. It was always, underneath, about love. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. What the Portrait Watched. He asked them to assemble on the terrace at 6 o'clock. He sent word through Despina, who conveyed it with the expressionless authority of a woman who has spent 9 years ensuring that things happen at the times they are meant to happen, and who does not consider it her place to have opinions about the reasons. By 10 minutes past 6, they were all present, arranged in the cream-coloured chairs with the last of the afternoon sun, drawing long shadows across the marble, and the sea below the cliff, burning with the deep, flat gold of early evening. Someone had, by habit or instinct, provided champagne. The glasses stood largely untouched. Poirot remained standing. It was, he had long since concluded, the correct posture for a final reckoning. It imposed a gentle asymmetry on the occasion that concentrated the attention of those seated in ways they were not always aware of. He looked at them each in turn before he spoke. Nikos, pale and very still, his hands around an untouched glass with the grip of a man holding something because he requires something to hold. Bellini, upright in his chair with the rigid composure of a man awaiting a verdict. He has had 3 days to prepare himself for, and has not, in the event, adequately prepared for. Leo Markovitch, with his jacket on and his expression arranged into its practiced neutrality, though the neutrality had, Poirot noted, acquired over the past 3 days a quality of genuine rather than performed calm. Helena, at the far end of the terrace near the balustrade where she had sat on the first afternoon, her champagne glass held in the old way, between 2 fingers, though she did not drink from it. Celeste sat apart from the others, slightly to Poirot's left, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes directed with a steadiness that was not quite composure and not quite grief at the middle distance. She had known, he thought, since he left the estate office. Yet perhaps she had known before that, in the way that people who are loved by someone capable of great devotion sometimes know, without being told, when that devotion has crossed an irreversible threshold. I will not, Poirot began, reconstruct the events of this case in the manner of a lecture. You are not students, and the facts, I believe, are known to most of you in their essential outline. What I will do is explain how I came to understand them, because understanding is what renders the facts useful, and it is understanding, not evidence, not accusation, that has always been, for me, the point. He moved to the low table at the centre of the terrace and placed upon it 3 objects he had carried from the gallery. The first was the cheap photograph, small and slightly faded, showing 2 young women in theatrical costumes before a painted backdrop. The second was a folded sheet of paper, the anonymous note Leo had found beneath his door. The third was a single botanical invoice in a clear folder, the relevant line underscored in pencil. No one reached for any of them. No one looked away from them either. The portrait was not the mystery, Poirot said. It was the occasion for the mystery, which is a different thing. Monsieur Vardakis acquired it not for its artistic merit, though it has some, but because it served as an ideal repository for documentation he wished to keep close and secure. Records of transactions, financial arrangements, and private information pertaining to a number of people, including several in this room. He was a man who collected leverage with the same systematic care he applied to his art collection. He paused. He also collected people. He liked to know that those around him required something from him that only he could provide. It was, one might say, his preferred aesthetic. Leo said nothing. Helena's expression did not shift. Bellini looked at the table. Each of you had a reason to wish him gone. Poirot continued without particular emphasis. Monsieur Markovitch, who wished to be free of an arrangement that had become extortion. Monsieur Bellini, whose gallery survived on Vardakis's conditional generosity and whose professional reputation was entangled in an authentication he knew to be insufficient. Madame Vardakis, who had watched her position diminish degree by degree and who had been told, 3 months ago, that whatever claims she might make on the future, she was outflanked. He turned slightly. And Mademoiselle Armand, who had agreed, under circumstances that left her very little choice, to a marriage that would have extinguished the life she had built with such considerable effort. Celeste did not move. But the wealthy, Poirot said quietly, as I remarked to myself some days ago, do not typically kill for money. They kill for what money pretends to supply: security, freedom, the sense that one is no longer at the mercy of something larger than oneself. He picked up the photograph and held it for a moment, looking at it, before setting it down again. The murder was committed by Sofia Duarte. The terrace was very quiet. The sea moved far below with its perpetual, unhurried indifference. The means were in her management, and she ordered the alkaloid compound from a specialist importer in Lisbon, 8 weeks before this gathering, using her employer's horticultural account. She had access to the brandy cabinet through her key. She had over 6 years of intimate professional proximity, the knowledge of every habit and preference of the man she served. He looked at the photograph again. She also had, which none of the rest of you possessed in quite the same measure, a motive that had nothing whatsoever to do with money. He allowed that to settle for a moment. She and Mademoiselle Armand knew each other long before either of them arrived at Villa Calypso. They had, between them, constructed new identities, new names, new histories, with the thoroughness of people who have excellent reasons for leaving the past behind them. Vardakis had discovered something of this history. He intended to use it to ensure that his proposed marriage to Celeste would take place on terms entirely favourable to himself. Poirot's voice remained level. Sophia killed him to prevent it. Not for inheritance, not for position. To remove the obstacle between Celeste and freedom. It is, in its way, the oldest of human motives, and the one that the little grey cells are most frequently asked to untangle. Nikos made a sound. It was not quite a word. It was the sound of something understood too late, and Poirot did not look at him. Bellini said with careful quietness, "Where is she now?" "In her room. She will be taken to Athens tomorrow when Sergeant Papadimitriou returns with the appropriate authorities." Poirot turned to face the gallery window through which, in the thickening dusk, the portrait was just visible. A pale rectangle of shadow at the far end of the dark room. I mentioned the documentation concealed behind the canvas. It has been removed and inventoried in the presence of the sergeant. It will be surrendered to the relevant legal bodies in due course. He looked at Leo and then at Bellini, and then, briefly, at Helena. The arrangements it describes will become, I expect, the subject of separate proceedings. I will not pretend this is comfortable news for anyone here, but I will not pretend otherwise either. Leo nodded once, with the precise economy of a man who has already calculated what this means, and made his peace with it. Bellini looked at the table. Helena looked at the sea. It was Celeste who spoke, and what she said surprised the terrace into a further silence of an entirely different quality. "She told me not to come this weekend," Celeste said. Her voice was very low. "She said he was planning something, that something had changed in him, and that I should find an excuse and not come." She looked at her hands. "I came anyway. I thought I could manage him. I thought I understood the dimensions of what he wanted." A pause. "She knew I would come, of course. She knew me well enough to know that." "Yes," Poirot said. "I believe she did. She did it because I would not save myself." Celeste's voice had the quality of a person speaking an answer to a question they have been working on for 3 days. "I never have. She has always understood that about me before I understood it myself." There was nothing useful to add to this. Juan Poirot, who had a considerable gift for useful addition, recognized the moments that required its opposite. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at the gallery window once more, at the pale rectangle of the portrait in the descending dark. The woman in the painting gazed, as she had always gazed at her invisible companion, with patience, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been watching a particular story for a very long time, and knows, though no one else yet does, precisely where it is going. She had watched the whole of it, the arrival and the unveiling and the shattered glass and the still mornings and the conversations arranged on terraces like the moves of a game, whose rules only one player fully understood. She had watched, and she had waited, and she had not been surprised by any of it. But Poirot turned away from the window. Around him, the golden world was doing what golden worlds eventually do. It was dissolving, quietly and without drama, into the ordinary dark. The champagne grew warm in its glasses. The sea moved below the cliff. The jasmine released its scent into the cooling air with the impartial generosity of something that has no opinion about the people it surrounds. Somewhere in the villa, a door closed, and the portrait watched on.